Thanks for being here. So Amir, a good friend of mine, talked about why folks at NVIDIA care about GPUHammer. Sorry. Okay. So, nope. So yeah, Amir talked about all of the awesome things that he's been involved in at NVIDIA with GPUHammer. I'll tell you why they care about GPUHammer now. Okay. So earlier this summer, GPUs were in the news, and not for good reasons. So we disclosed GPUHammer around sometime early this year, and it made a lot of news, and more articles keep coming out. So let's try to unpack what GPUHammer is and why we should care about it. So we know all about row hammer. You hammer a particular aggressor row, and neighboring rows start to have bit flips, right? This has been well known since almost 2014 now. So feel like a broken record. The most important thing is that this problem is actually getting worse and worse with each DRAM generation. So you'll notice all of these are CPU memories, and so for the last 10 years, we've only known about CPU memories having this problem. And people have shown a wide variety of exploits on CPUs, including page table tampering to achieve privilege escalation, breaking crypto protocols to steal keys, and so on. But who else uses DRAM? Right? In fact, the most expensive part in our systems and laptops or servers right now are actually GPUs. And GPUs use a ton of DRAM. So the key question we asked was, are GPUs vulnerable to GPUHammer? And if they are, what does that mean for the ML models I spent $100 million to train and deploy? Right? So that's the question we started out by asking, are GPUs vulnerable to GPUHammer? And so we first started asking this question about, okay, what's the threat model? The simplest threat model is time-sliced usage of GPUs, where, let's say, you run an ML model on a particular GPU in a workstation. So we picked an A6000 GPU with GDDR6 memory that's available in workstations, but also available in cloud. And a lot of these companies like Google, Amazon, Alibaba provide Kubernetes-based, environments where you can actually share GPUs across multiple potentially distrusting users. So in this case, you can imagine a scenario where a victim is running an ML model on the GPU, and it's being time-sliced with potentially an attacker who can run CUDA code. So in this case, the data of both users sitting in the GPU DRAM. So how do we actually launch GPUHammer attacks in this scenario? So steps to launch GPUHammer are extremely simple. First, you need to identify two neighboring rows. And second, you need to hammer at it. Like you need to really access, row 1 and row 2. And if these two rows sandwich another victim row, it's going to have a bit flip. GPUs, since Ampere generation, actually provide the primitives to be able to do this, to repeatedly load, virtual addresses. And they also allow you to flush things from the cache. So you can actually get, memory accesses to desired addresses at a reasonable rate. Okay, so if it's this easy, why have we waited 10 years for it? So there are several challenges for GPUHammer. The first challenge is that we actually don't know the memory layouts. Folks have reverse engineered the address to like virtual to physical, physical to DRAM, bank, row, etc. on CPUs. We don't know this on GPUs. In fact, a user doesn't even see physical addresses on GPUs. You really have to go and change the driver to be able to do that. So it's actually very hard to know exactly which virtual addresses map to rows that are neighboring in the same DRAM bank. The second problem is that GPUs are actually throughput-oriented processors, so they have amazing bandwidth of memory access, but latency is actually pretty high. So if you try to, hammer in the way you hammered on CPUs, you'll actually get very low hammering intensity because your latency is almost about 5x the CPU latency. So it's, again, hard to hammer with the high rate. And third, again, we don't know about what defenses the memory vendors have implemented inside these GPU DRAM. So we unravel each of these challenges, and first let's understand how we, work around the unknown memory layouts. So for row hammer, we really need to hammer two rows that are preferably one away from each other, right? So maybe we can pick one address to hammer, like 0xa, but then how do we know which address maps to row 3? Because we don't know this layout. Well, fortunately, there are some prevalent techniques to figure this out. So DRAM basically is divided into banks, and each of these banks have their own row buffer. And we want to find addresses that map to the same bank in neighboring rows. So we simply try to search for a row buffer conflict. If you access a pair of addresses that map to different banks, they use different row buffers, so there's no conflict. Accesses are fast. But if you access two addresses mapping to the same bank and different rows, there exists a row buffer conflict when you try to access them, and that leads to high latency. This is well known on CPUs, so we tried this out. It actually doesn't work on GPUs. The main reason it doesn't work is because, well, GPUs have a lot of memory. So there's a new source of high latency, which is simply non-uniform memory access, or what we call NUMA. So because the DRAM is kind of spread out, if you try to access a pair of addresses, you might actually see high latency just because one of them is just far away from the core that you accessed it from. So we really need to filter out for these NUMA behaviors. Unfortunately, we can do that with a simple insight. If you see a pair of addresses have high latency, it could be because of row buffer conflict or because of NUMA. So you simply access them individually. If they are on the same bank, they have to have the same latency, right? They can't be like different latencies between the two addresses. So we simply kind of filter out for this NUMA behavior by taking all of the addresses with high latency, like address pairs with high latency, and checking whether both of the addresses have the same latency when accessed separately. So once we do this filtering, we actually get really nice kind of separation between addresses that map to different bank versus same bank when accessed in pairs. So we now know which addresses map to the same bank, and what we figured is that within the bank, there really is no randomization. So if you can, figure out which addresses map to the same bank, typically they are in contiguous rows. So now that we know something about the mappings, we can start hammering. Then we come to the second challenge. When we try to hammer in a single thread, as we did on the CPU LAN, the latency is much higher. So our hammering rate is much lower. So shown here is simply, hammering intensity on the y-axis, as in how many activations can you do to DRAM in a given refresh period of about 32 milliseconds. Well, if you try to hammer in a single-threaded manner, the way you did it on a CPU, the amount of activations you can get is about only 15% of the theoretical maximum, which is all the way above here. So this is bad, right? Like, we're not going to get bit flips if we don't hammer the memory. Well, fortunately, GPUs are, excellent at providing parallelism. So we say, why should we stick to one thread? We have thousands of threads. So what we started doing is a multi-thread hammering. And that already kind of bumped up the hammering intensity. But we figured out that GPUs also have two kinds of parallelism. One is spatial parallelism, which is with multi-threads, but also temporal parallelism with warps. And so we figured that, well, warp hammering with multiple warps is even better. And yeah, with that, we actually reach almost 93% of the hammering intensity. Okay, so that's good. We can now hammer. But what about these defenses that are sitting inside the DRAM? Amar talked about TRR, TRR is simple. What it typically does, this is common knowledge, that if you try to hammer one row, the in-DRAM tracker tries to identify the hammered row and then mitigates, neighboring rows with a targeted refresh. So prior CPU-based attacks have also tried to overcome this with really two goals. The first goal is to hammer many rows in parallel so that you can overwhelm this tracker. And second is to hammer in a way that is synchronized with refresh instances, because mitigations happen on refresh instances. So if you hammer in a synchronized manner with mitigations, you can fool the mitigation in the same way each time. And therefore, one particular row continues to escape mitigation every time you hammer. So prior work actually studies this in a single-threaded setting. Once you go to multi-threaded settings, like we do on GPUs, it gets messed up. And so we had to kind of reverse engineer exactly how can we get synchronization. What we figured was that, okay, you can get synchronization if you add delays, but then it's not very stable. And therefore, we also then go to some more complex hammering patterns, which is like a multi-warp plus multi-thread hammering, which seems to be stable for who knows why, but it works. And we have more details in the paper. So just to give you a sense of how our attack patterns now look, we have several warps that are executing in parallel. Each row is being hammered from a different warp. And then we have these delays inserted in each warp that again overlap with the refresh instance, so that our hammering kind of continues to synchronize with the refresh. Okay, so now that we have all of the challenges resolved and we have nice hammering kernels, let's hammer at it. So we tried a bunch of GPUs, and one fortunately ended up giving us bit flips. So particularly this A6000 with GDDR6 memory ended up getting bit flips in pretty much every DRAM bank we hammered. We had to hammer with specific patterns, which is specific n-sided patterns. So hammering with anything more than 16 actually ended up giving us nice bit flips. So this kind of pointed us to the fact that, well, row hammer is a problem on GPUs. And yeah. So then we did, what academics like to do. We characterized how bad the problem is. Right. So we took a bunch of these bit flips and gradually started reducing the amount of hammering we do on them to see what is the minimum amount of hammers you need to do to be able to get a bit flip. And we found that for a bunch of these bit flips, the minimum activations you need to do to get a bit flip is around 12,000. And this is actually in the same ballpark as some of the DDR4 DRAM that has been characterized in the past. So it makes sense. These were also produced, GDDR6 that we attacked also were produced in the same time frame as DDR4. So maybe the cells are the same. The other thing we tried to do was try to figure out which access patterns, which rows to hammer to actually get the bit flip. And unlike conventional wisdom, which suggests hammering from both sides of the victim, we actually found that simply hammering on one side is sufficient for many of the bits. For several other bits, we also found that, well, two-sided hammering works as well. But this was surprising to us that one-sided hammering seems to work very well as two-sided for certain bit flips. So again, not sure what's happening inside there. Maybe the DRAM vendors can figure it out. And third, we found that, well, the tracker sizes are also in the same realm as DDR4. So we found that in this particular instance, the tracker was 16 entry. So using this, we try to test what you can do with these bit flips on machine learning models, because that's pretty much what you do on GPUs. So prior works have shown a variety of malicious goals, including accuracy degradation, trying to insert backdoors so that your stop sign could misclassify a yield sign into 80 miles per hour. And also, trying to jailbreak LLMs using these bit flips. So we said, okay, let's take the simplest possible attack because we already know how these attacks work. So we took the simplest possible attack, terminal brain damage, and tried to see if we could use these bit flips to degrade accuracy. So our attack works in a very simple manner. What it does is the attacker first allocates a lot of memory, and then frees the region of memory that it knows has bit flips, then lets the victim run. The victim, well, this is the only space that it has in the DRAM, so that's where it goes. And if this is the bit that is vulnerable, then the attacker simply hammers from the other side, and that bit kind of flips from 0 to 1. And this is apparently sufficient for accuracy degradation. We saw that if this bit flip happens in the top bit of the exponent of any random weight out of the hundreds of millions of weights that you have, it's actually very, very effective for a bunch of CNNs. We found that this degrades accuracy from almost 80% to less than 0.1%. So just a single bit flip is good enough. It doesn't need to be targeted. You just keep trying. As long as it's in the right offset, your model is going to be useless. So we disclosed this to NVIDIA early this year, and NVIDIA released a nice security notice saying, well, pretty much every GPU that they've manufactured, please turn on ECC. So that's a good thing to do, by the way. We should use ECC for all our systems. Unfortunately, for some of these GPUs, especially the workstation ones, that don't natively support ECC, enabling ECC actually comes with significant costs. It reduces capacity by 6% and also reduces bandwidth and performance by about 10%. So this may be the cost to pay for security, but I think we should be, I'm not sure if everybody is turning on ECC yet, so maybe things won't be as good. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is that, well, ECC is good. We should turn it on, but it's not a foolproof mitigation, as Patrick might have something to say later today. But yeah, the takeaway here is that we should really be focusing towards more principled mitigations like PRAC, which hopefully will come in future DRAM. So yeah, the takeaway from this, at least part of my talk, is that GPUHammer is no longer just a CPU problem. It's a GPU problem as well, and it could be a problem for other chips that use DRAM. It's hard to pull it off, but it's not impossible, and the effects can be catastrophic. I can maybe pause and see if there are one or two questions, and otherwise I'll move on. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that the ECC is not a foolproof
Yes.
mitigation.
Yeah.
Do you have some figures or some numbers that give us some?
So I don't have figures. The rate at which we were able to flip bits inside this particular GPU, we never saw a multi-bit flip within a code word that the ECC uses. So enabling this single error correction, double error detection ECC would solve at least the bit flips we observed. But who knows, right? Like this is just one one chip that we profiled. A different chip could have maybe 10x more bit flips. Maybe there are more efficient patterns to hammer with that could increase the number of bit flips. So it's at this point just turn on ECC and pray.
Because if you combine the inside the RAM, I would say ECC plus the link ECC, you have also a link ECC for the signal. And I mean, for me, it reduces considerably the probability to have.
Yeah. So I would. I think
it's enabled by default. ECC for this such a.
It's not. No. I know there are few vendors that don't do it.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe I'll move on. and move on to defenses, right? So I talked about attacks and how we need principled defenses like PRAC. Well, PRAC is a good solution, but as Amar hinted, it's not a be-all and end-all. We still need to care about the details, right? It's important to dot the I's and cross the T's. And I'll show you why. So as I mentioned, row hammer threshold is dropping with each generation. And it's dropped by almost 14x in the last 10 years to the realm of a few thousand hammers introducing bit flips. So we need mitigations that are scalable to low row hammer thresholds. Fortunately, the DRAM industry has been thinking about this, and in April 2024, they came out with this specification called per row activation counting mitigation, called PRAC. The key idea of this is that each row in DRAM would be accompanied with activation counters. So each row has activation count, and anytime the row is activated beyond a certain threshold, the DRAM now has the ability to signal to the memory controller that, hey, I need a mitigation for this particular row. Please send me a mitigation. Give me time to mitigate this row. So the memory controller is supposed to send RFM command, which is like a mitigation command. And this basically gives DRAM extra time to perform the mitigation. So it refreshes the neighbors. Okay. So this is good. This is a very principled way of thinking about it. The problem here is that the lies in the details, right? Devil is always in the details. In the PRAC specification, the way it's laid out, at any given instant, if the activation causes a counter to cross the threshold, the DRAM raises an alert signal to the memory controller. The memory controller actually has some time before it needs to send a mitigation. It has about 180 nanoseconds, after which it can send the mitigation. In this period, the memory controller can actually send more activations, and we call these ABO acts. So these extra activations actually provide a new vulnerability surface, because you're really providing the attacker an extra time, a gap between you detecting the attack and issuing the mitigation. So now this extra activations that can be performed in this gap can be weaponized to launch new attacks. So it becomes really critical to keep track of pending mitigations so that they can't be weaponized. And the problem is that PRAC is a specification, it's not an implementation. The specification has no mention of how one should keep track of rows that already have crossed the threshold and require a mitigation. So, and as we all know, the security of any given implementation really depends on the implementation. Otherwise, we'd all be out of the business of security, right? So why is this important? Well, there have been several implementations that have come out in the last year or so that propose a solution using this PRAC mechanism. One of the first solutions, called UPRAC, actually was a really nice piece of work. It showed that what are the security guarantees you can get if you design something that meets the spec. In this work, they didn't provide any details on how to keep track of mitigations, right? And if you don't have a mitigation queue, you can actually end up, to meet the spec, search through all the rows in DRAM at any time you receive a RFM to figure out which row to mitigate, right? Like, I need to mitigate the highest activated row. How do I know, right? The naive way to do this is to search through the entire DRAM, and that's really not scalable, because it would just mean your system is freezing. It would mean latency of almost 10 milliseconds. So yeah, we need practical ways of keeping track of pending mitigations. Well, another prior work, this is actually one from Microsoft, which inspired prac called Panopticon. So Panopticon essentially proposed a FIFO-based mitigation queue for keeping track of mitigations. And the key idea was that, if any one row kind of crosses the threshold of mitigation, it gets inserted into this queue. If another row crosses this mitigation, inserts into this queue, and so on. And when this queue is full, the queue can be flushed out, and you can continue executing. The problem is that at that time, when they came up with this design, they didn't have the spec, right? The spec kind of put in this 180 nanosecond of extra time for the attacker. If this implementation is used to, implement the spec, then this leads to a problem where basically you can now hammer another row T, while this FIFO queue is full. So basically, you hammer a sequential pattern of A, B, and C, cause the queue to become full. Now there's no more space in the queue. When row C gets inserted, queue becomes full, an alert is raised to the memory controller. Memory controller actually has more time. This time can be used by the attacker. And this is exactly when it's going to hammer this row T. Row T also has crossed the threshold, but there's no space to insert it into the queue. And wow, fun, right? And the attacker can actually repeat this, multiple times. So it can continue to, hammer other rows, fill up the queue, right? So here in this case, we hammer row A again, fill up the queue. When the queue is full, again, we hammer row T. So at no point, actually, row T gets a mitigation because the DRAM doesn't have space to keep track of this mitigation. Right? So with this, we show that you can hammer a particular row all the way to about 1300 times, surpassing the actual mitigation threshold, which is actually 32. Right? So it's almost like more than an order of magnitude activations. Right? So with this, we can easily break Panopticon in less than a second. So with this work, we called QPrac. We said, okay, how do you actually come up with a good implementation that meets the spec and also is secure against these kinds of attacks? So with QPrac, we said, well, simple observation, rather than using a FIFO queue, why don't you use a priority queue, which can keep track of pending mitigations, and if a new row is hammered more than the existing rows that require mitigation, that needs to bubble up in priority. You need to start tracking it. So the way it works is that now our priority queue maintains addresses and counts, not just addresses like FIFO. And here, what we do is whenever a row is activated, it gets inserted into this queue. And so you could have many rows being activated, all of them go into the queue. When a given row reaches a threshold, it comes to the top. Now, this queue can be easily filled up by simply accessing more rows than the queue entries. But even when it is full, if let's say the attacker tries to hammer a fourth row, this has now an activation count of 2. This will still be inserted into the queue because, 2 is greater than the minimum count entry inside the queue. So it will evict the minimum entry inside the queue and insert it at the bottom. If row D is hammered more, this will actually bubble up. So in this case, if row B crossed the threshold first and caused ABO, row B will get mitigated, but if row D is also hammered, that could potentially also be mitigated. So I'll show you how an example of how QPrac prevents the attack I just described. So in this case, if you were hammering A, B, C equally, and all three were in the priority queue, ready to be mitigated. If row A crosses the threshold and sends an alert and is ready to be mitigated, in that extra activations, if I try to hammer row T and cause it to go, from 19 to 20, it's actually going to come into this queue because this count is higher than the minimum count here. And so it's going to be tracked even when the queue is full. And if I hammer row T more than the highest activated count, it's actually going to bubble up, right? So now when I get an alert and RFM, it's row T that's going to receive the mitigation and not the rows that were inserted in, first come, first serve. So basically, the high level idea is that rows that require mitigation are actually prioritized for mitigation first, and rows that, are less activated, they can be mitigated later. Right? So with this, we mitigate the fill and escape attack I talked about. And we also, bounded the security guarantees of this defense against more general attacks that have been shown to be optimal in prior work. And we showed that this particular defense can, safely tolerate a row hammer threshold of 50 to 70 by using a particular threshold to introduce ABOs. These guarantees are also provided with reasonably good performance. So we evaluated QPRAC against a bunch of benchmarks and added in some additional optimizations to improve performance and reduce the number of alerts. So in particular, we added in this opportunistic mitigation where if one bank receives an ABO, other banks can also perform mitigations. And also we have additional opportunities for mitigations on refreshes. So we added in that proactive mitigation. So in combination with both of these, the overall slowdown is negligible. And finally, we also added in some energy optimizations to ensure that not only do we have low performance overhead, we also have a very low energy overhead of less than 2%. So the takeaways here are that, well, even if you have a really nice principled spec, finally, the security guarantees depend on the implementation. Prior designs are either, having practicality issues or security issues, and therefore we really should be, focusing on the details of the implementation and reasoning why they are secure. And QPRAC, in my opinion, provides a good security at sub 100 row hammer threshold. So I'll conclude my talk by basically leaving you with three key messages. Security is critical, but it's even more critical to secure DRAM in all the pieces of hardware we're putting into our systems, CPUs, GPUs, and maybe even potentially new accelerators. The hard part is that we really require a very careful design for mitigations to be truly secure. I mean, we saw that with PRAC. We really need to be careful, and often the devil is in the details. And unfortunately, I think, need a lot more effort on attacks, because that's when we know what are the corner cases where our defenses break, and that's how we get better defenses. So hopefully some of you can be inspired to also join into the row hammer attack gang. And yeah, thank you. Questions?
Why do we need why can't we think about an option in the DRAM that make the mitigation by its own without sending the alert? Because when sending the alert, so you lose this time, which makes the vulnerable.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Why can't we think about an optional, I would say, configuration of the DRAM that doesn't send the alert and take the initiative to directly mitigate the attack?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was for the audience, why doesn't the DRAM perform mitigations on its own? Why does it signal to the CPU and, lead to all of these kinds of problems. So the short answer is that DRAM, there's another acronym for it. It's called also dumb RAM. It by design, it can't take decisions that impact timings. So it has to adhere to a very strict, protocol where the memory controller is the one giving it commands, and it, is supposed to do those operations in those timing constraints. So the places where it has slack to actually perform mitigations as required are very limited. So until DDR4, the only instance where mitigations were performed were whenever it got a refresh command, where it was going to refresh some rows for data integrity. In addition, it would also perform some mitigations. But what's happening, at least my understanding, is that the number of rows that require mitigation is increasing, and we just don't have enough time to be able to perform all the mitigations that we want to do. So that's mainly the reason why you want, this memory controller to give you more time. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. We did not, but there's only, with 50% probability, I can tell you which vendor it is, because there are only two vendors that serve GPUs, Samsung and Micron. Unfortunately, we could have, removed the packaging and tried to see what's inside, but that would mean we lose our, GPU with bit flips, and it's also a $10,000 part. So, I don't think, my understanding is that this is not a vendor specific problem. It's a industry problem. So I would be surprised if, one vendor is not vulnerable and the other is. Both might be vulnerable, but to varying degrees. That would be my sense. Yes.
What are you going to do in the next research group on this topic? Are you going to get now GPUs, and are you also going to start like a hammer lab? We have a couple of them in the world. Are you also going to be now the GPUHammer guy, or have you seen enough?
I think it's interesting. We're definitely curious to know more about what's lying in there. So we'll try. We'll see. It's as you probably know, it's until you get a new bit flip, it's very hard to predict where that bit flip is going to come from. So we'll try and see. And we have about 3 or 4 GPUs now. Yeah. But they're also expensive, right? So that's I think one of the main challenges with hammering GPUs. Unlike CPUs, where you just need to buy a DRAM module and you plug a new one in, and you can actually, get a lot of data. With GPUs, you need to really go and buy a new GPU, and a DRAM module costs maybe 100 or 200. GPU costs 10,000, and that's, I think, one of the big challenges. So if industry is willing to fund some of our GPU purchases, I'm happy to kind of talk to you about it. Yeah, we tried that. The issue is that, I suspect, we tried that. We weren't successful, in getting bit flips in the cloud. I don't know why that is. It could be that maybe we're just unlucky. We also didn't have infinite amount of money to burn on renting cloud GPUs. They're also expensive. But I think it could also be that maybe individual customers are sold worse parts than cloud vendors. I don't know. I just have hypotheses at this point. Thank you.